The story of Ted Bundy is one of the most chilling and unsettling sagas in American history. It is the story of a man who appeared charming, intelligent, and ambitious, yet behind that mask of normalcy, he harbored a darkness so deep that it shocked the world when it was finally revealed. When people think of Bundy, they often imagine the smiling law student in a suit, the well-spoken young man who seemed destined for success. But beneath the polished exterior was a manipulative predator who managed to deceive nearly everyone around him. This is not just the story of Bundy's crimes. It is the story of how a seemingly ordinary man could hide such terrifying secrets. It is the story of how he slipped through the cracks of law enforcement again and again. And most of all, it is the story of a mind that remains one of the most disturbing puzzles in the history of criminology. Ted Bundy was born on November 24, 1946, in Burlington, Vermont. His childhood was filled with confusion and secrecy. For much of his early life, Bundy was told that his grandparents were his parents, and that his real mother was his sister. This lie shaped the foundation of his identity, planting seeds of anger, shame, and mistrust. While outwardly he seemed like a bright, curious child, those who knew him recall moments of odd behavior. He struggled with feelings of isolation. He didn't quite fit in with other children, and he became fascinated with control and dominance at an early age. But to most people, Ted Bundy looked like a normal boy from a modest family. There were no glaring signs that he would one day become one of the most infamous criminals in American history. As Bundy grew older, he developed an ability that would define his life. The ability to blend in. He learned how to smile at the right times, say the right things, and charm those around him. He could be funny, engaging, even charismatic. Teachers, neighbors, and friends often described him as polite and intelligent. But behind closed doors, Bundy struggled with darker impulses he could not control. In his teenage years, Bundy began to show disturbing tendencies. He would prowl neighborhoods at night, peering into windows. He became fascinated with the idea of power over others, particularly women. These behaviors went unnoticed by most, dismissed as the quirks of a quiet, reserved young man. By the time he entered college in the 1960s, Bundy had mastered the art of presenting himself as the perfect young man. He studied psychology, volunteered at political campaigns, and even worked at a crisis hotline where he helped strangers who were contemplating their own darkest moments. Ironically, callers described him as compassionate and attentive, never realizing that the man on the other end of the line was hiding monstrous secrets. The question that has haunted experts ever since is this: what made Ted Bundy who he was? Was it nature or nurture? Was it his troubled childhood, his feelings of abandonment, or something wired deep in his brain? Some psychologists argue that Bundy was born with a lack of empathy, unable to feel compassion the way most humans do. Others believe his early environment, marked by secrecy, shame, and emotional distance, played a major role in shaping his behavior. What is clear is that Bundy learned to live a double life. On one side he was the law student, the political volunteer, the boyfriend, the friend. On the other side he was developing into something far darker. By the early 1970s, Bundy was living in Washington state and pursuing law school. He seemed like a young man with ambition and charm, someone who could easily climb the social ladder. But this was also the period when his dark urges began to take control. Bundy began approaching women in public places, often pretending to be injured or in need of help. He would wear a sling or carry books he pretended were too heavy, luring strangers with kindness before revealing his true intentions. It was a chilling display of manipulation. Bundy knew how to exploit the natural compassion of others. He relied on the fact that most people wanted to help someone in need. This tactic would become his signature approach, and tragically, it would cost many young women their lives. By 1974, disappearances of young women in Washington and Oregon began to make headlines. The cases were disturbing in their similarity. College-aged women vanishing without a trace, often last seen near college campuses or public places. Witnesses began describing a man who was handsome, well-spoken, and often introduced himself with a single name: Ted. What made Bundy so dangerous was not just his violence, but his ability to appear harmless. He didn't look like the image of a monster people imagined. Instead, he looked like the boy next door, the man you'd trust to carry your groceries or help change your tire. This deception gave him the power to walk among his victims undetected, to gain their trust in moments when they were most vulnerable. As the disappearances continued, fear spread across college campuses. Students were warned to travel in groups, to be cautious of strangers, and to trust their instincts. But still, Bundy managed to slip through unnoticed. He was careful, calculating, and always one step ahead. For law enforcement, the challenge was enormous. This was an era before DNA technology, before the modern databases that police rely on today. Investigators had only witness descriptions and scattered evidence, with no way to connect the dots across different states. Bundy thrived in this environment, moving freely, changing his tactics, and perfecting his ability to blend in. In hindsight, what makes Ted Bundy so terrifying is not just what he did, it's how long he was able to get away with it. He studied the law, he understood the psychology of people, and he used those skills to manipulate everyone around him. He could sit in a courtroom and defend himself with confidence. He could stand in front of a camera and charm reporters. And all the while, he carried the weight of his darkest secrets. The mask of Ted Bundy was flawless. But as we'll see in the chapters ahead, even the most careful predators eventually slip. And when Bundy slipped, the world finally saw the truth of who he really was. By the mid-1970s, Ted Bundy had perfected his double life. To the outside world, he was a law student, a charming young man, even a romantic partner. But behind the facade, Bundy was developing into a predator unlike anything America had seen before. The year 1974 marked the beginning of a reign of terror in the Pacific Northwest. One after another, young women vanished under mysterious circumstances. Most were students, intelligent and ambitious, with their whole lives ahead of them. The pattern was chilling. Many were last seen in public places. Many had been approached by a man who seemed injured, perhaps with his arm in a sling or his leg in a cast, asking for help carrying books or loading something into his car. That man, of course, was Bundy. At first, investigators struggled to connect the dots. The disappearances happened across different campuses, in different cities, with no obvious connection. There were no security cameras, no cell phone records, and no digital footprint to trace. Witnesses could only provide vague descriptions of a tall, handsome man with a friendly smile who sometimes introduced himself as Ted. It wasn't much to go on. But as the disappearances mounted, the public began to panic. Newspapers ran headlines about missing women, and whispers of a possible serial predator began to spread. On college campuses, students started walking in pairs. Parents warned their daughters not to talk to strangers. But Bundy thrived on that fear, using it to his advantage. One of the most infamous turning points came on July 14, 1974, at Lake Sammamish State Park in Washington. It was a sunny summer day, and thousands of people had gathered at the lake to swim, picnic, and enjoy the outdoors. In the middle of this crowd, Bundy walked confidently, approaching women with a friendly smile. He introduced himself simply as Ted, and told them he needed help loading a sailboat onto his car. His arm was in a sling, making him look harmless, even vulnerable. Several women turned him down, sensing something strange, but 2 women that day would go missing, Janice Ott and Denise Naslund. Their disappearances shocked investigators. For the first time, witnesses came forward in large numbers, all describing the same man. Handsome, well-dressed, with his arm in a sling. And crucially, they all remembered his name, Ted. This was a turning point. For the first time, police had a suspect profile. A man named Ted, possibly driving a Volkswagen Beetle, connected to multiple missing women. Tips began pouring in, and Ted Bundy's name was mentioned more than once. But here's where Bundy's mask worked against investigators. He didn't fit the image of a violent criminal. Bundy was a law student. He had connections in politics. He volunteered for community projects. He had a girlfriend, friends, and professors who spoke highly of him. When his name came up as a suspect, many dismissed it. Surely not him. Surely not Ted Bundy. But Bundy wasn't done. As the investigation grew more intense in Washington, he shifted his focus. He moved to Utah to attend law school at the University of Utah. And soon, young women began disappearing there as well. The pattern was the same. Women vanishing near college campuses, approached by a man who appeared charming and harmless. In Utah, Bundy was eventually arrested for the first time in 1975. Not for murder, but for something far smaller: suspicion of burglary. Police pulled him over and found suspicious items in his car: handcuffs, a ski mask, rope, and other tools that looked disturbingly like a kit for abduction. Though the evidence wasn't enough to connect him to the disappearances, investigators began to look at Bundy much more closely. During questioning, Bundy was calm, polite, even confident. He denied everything, insisting he was being targeted unfairly. And once again, his charm worked in his favor. But as police dug deeper, they began to link him to more and more cases. By now, multiple states, Washington, Oregon, Utah, and Colorado, were dealing with unsolved disappearances that seemed connected. The challenge for law enforcement was coordination. This was a time before nationwide databases, and communication between police departments in different states was slow. Bundy used this to his advantage, moving from place to place, staying one step ahead. As pressure mounted, Bundy's mask began to crack. In 1976, he was convicted of kidnapping in Utah and sentenced to prison. For many, it seemed like the nightmare might finally be over. But Bundy wasn't finished. He began studying law in prison, preparing his own appeals. He charmed guards, acted as his own legal counsel, and used his intelligence to exploit every loophole he could find. And then, in 1977, Bundy pulled off something few expected. He escaped. The first escape came in June 1977, from a courthouse in Aspen, Colorado, where he was representing himself in a case. Because he insisted on serving as his own lawyer, Bundy was given access to the law library without shackles. He used the opportunity to jump out of a second-story window and flee into the mountains. For 6 days, he evaded capture, surviving on the wilderness before being recaptured. But the fact that he managed to escape at all showed how dangerous and determined he really was. Then, just months later, Bundy did it again. In December 1977, while awaiting trial in jail, he managed to lose weight, squeeze through a small hole in the ceiling of his cell, and escape once more. This time, he vanished into the night. This second escape would prove catastrophic. Bundy fled to Florida, where he would commit some of his most infamous crimes. His time in Florida would not only end his spree but also cement his place in American history as one of the most notorious killers of all time. But even as his crimes became more brazen, one question lingered. How could someone like Ted Bundy, so intelligent, so outwardly normal, commit such unimaginable acts? The answer lies not just in his actions, but in his psychology. Bundy wasn't motivated by money or revenge. He was motivated by power, control, and an insatiable desire to dominate. And as the nation would soon discover, Florida would be the stage for his final and most dramatic downfall. When Ted Bundy escaped from jail in December 1977, he slipped away into the night with nothing but his cunning to guide him. He had lost weight deliberately, squeezed through a hole in the ceiling of his cell, and walked right out of the Colorado jail undetected. For the second time in just 6 months, Bundy was free. But this time, he had no intention of hiding quietly. He traveled thousands of miles across the country and ended up in Florida, a place far from the states where he was already under suspicion. He hoped the distance would protect him. He hoped that once again, his mask of charm and normalcy would shield him. But in Florida, Bundy's behavior spiraled out of control. His carefully calculated mask began to crack, and his violence escalated in ways even investigators could not have imagined. By January 1978, Bundy was living under an alias, moving from place to place in Tallahassee. He stayed in cheap boarding houses, often stealing credit cards and IDs to get by. But soon his darker impulses returned. On the night of January 15, 1978, Bundy entered the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University. What happened inside shocked the nation. In the early hours of the morning, while students slept, Bundy attacked multiple young women. The details of that night remain among the most horrifying of his crimes. To stay within YouTube's policies, the important point is not the graphic detail but the aftermath. 2 young women lost their lives, and several others were gravely injured. Bundy had unleashed his rage in a setting filled with people, showing a recklessness that investigators had not seen before. This was not the careful, manipulative Bundy who lured women in public with a fake injury. This was Bundy in full chaos, angry, reckless, and terrifying. After the Chi Omega attack, Bundy wasn't finished. Just weeks later, he struck again, abducting and ending the life of a 12-year-old girl named Kimberly Leach. This final crime, committed in broad daylight, would ultimately seal Bundy's fate. For years, he had managed to outsmart law enforcement. For years, he had been the chameleon who slipped through cracks in the system. But now Bundy was growing sloppy. His escapes, his recklessness, and his inability to control his impulses were catching up with him. On February 15, 1978, Bundy was pulled over by police in Pensacola, Florida. When the officer stopped him, Bundy gave a false name. But as police searched the stolen car he was driving, they discovered stolen credit cards and IDs. Soon they realized who they had in custody: Theodore Bundy, the escaped fugitive who had been on the run for weeks. The arrest marked the end of Bundy's freedom. But it was only the beginning of one of the most infamous trials in American history. Bundy's trial for the Chi Omega murders began in 1979, and from the start, it was unlike anything the country had ever seen. For the first time, a murder trial was broadcast live on national television. Millions of Americans tuned in to watch the proceedings, captivated by the shocking story. And at the center of it all was Ted Bundy, representing himself in court. Bundy believed he was smarter than everyone else. He believed he could manipulate the system, charm the jury, and outwit the prosecutors. He questioned witnesses, argued legal points, and tried to present himself as a respectable law student wrongfully accused. But to those watching, it was clear: Bundy was more interested in performing than defending himself. The trial exposed Bundy's narcissism like never before. Instead of focusing on the evidence, he often tried to turn the spotlight on himself. He smiled at cameras, spoke confidently to reporters, and seemed to enjoy the attention. Some observers even noted that Bundy appeared to be performing for an audience, as though he believed he was the star of his own courtroom drama. But the evidence against him was overwhelming. Witnesses placed him near the crime scenes. Forensic evidence linked him to the attacks. And his erratic behavior only made him look more suspicious. After weeks of testimony, the jury reached its verdict: Ted Bundy was guilty of the Chi Omega murders. He was sentenced to death. But even as Bundy faced death row, the story didn't end there. In 1980 he was tried again, this time for the murder of Kimberly Leach. Once again, Bundy tried to play the role of his own lawyer. And once again, the jury saw through his act. He was found guilty and given a second death sentence. At this point, Bundy's fate was sealed. He would spend the rest of his life in prison, awaiting execution. Yet even from death row, Bundy continued to fascinate and disturb the public. Journalists interviewed him, psychologists studied him, and even ordinary citizens wrote him letters. Some women, shockingly, expressed admiration for him, convinced that he was innocent or misunderstood. Bundy's charm, even in captivity, still had power. Perhaps one of the most bizarre moments came during his second trial, when Bundy, acting as his own attorney, used a legal loophole to marry his girlfriend, Carolyn Boone, right there in the courtroom. He simply asked her to marry him while she was on the witness stand, and under Florida law, that counted as a legal marriage. The spectacle left many shaking their heads. It was yet another example of how Bundy used charm and manipulation, even when his life was hanging by a thread. But as the years passed, Bundy could no longer escape the truth. In prison, facing execution, he finally began to open up, though only selectively. He gave interviews in which he described his compulsions, his inability to control his urges, and his belief that something deep within him was broken. Psychologists described him as a classic example of psychopathy. Intelligent, manipulative, lacking empathy, and driven by power and control. Bundy himself admitted that he felt no genuine remorse, only regret that his life had turned out the way it had. For many, these interviews offered a chilling glimpse into a mind unlike any other. In January 1989, after years of appeals and delays, Bundy was executed in Florida's electric chair. Crowds gathered outside the prison, some cheering, some holding signs, and others simply waiting to see the chapter close on one of America's darkest stories. Bundy's death marked the end of a saga that had terrified the nation for more than a decade. But his story didn't fade away. Instead, it became a case study for criminologists, psychologists, and law enforcement officers who wanted to understand how someone so outwardly normal could commit such monstrous acts. The legacy of Ted Bundy is one of warning. He showed the world that evil doesn't always come in the form of a stranger lurking in the shadows. Sometimes it comes in the form of a smiling young man in a suit, someone who looks like he could be your neighbor, your classmate, or your friend. Bundy's story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about human nature, about deception, and about the darkness that can hide behind the most ordinary faces. And while his life ended decades ago, the mystery of his mind continues to haunt us. The story of Ted Bundy does not end with his trial or even his execution. In many ways, it was only the beginning of a larger cultural obsession. Bundy became more than a criminal. He became a symbol, a case study of charm, manipulation, and evil hidden in plain sight. His story forced psychologists, law enforcement, and even ordinary citizens to ask, how could someone like him exist? One of the most chilling aspects of Bundy's life is how ordinary he appeared. Bundy didn't fit the stereotype of a violent predator. He wasn't an outcast living on the fringes of society. He wasn't visibly unstable or threatening. Instead, he was handsome, intelligent, and ambitious. He went to college. He volunteered at a suicide hotline, where he was known for being kind and attentive. He dated women who described him as thoughtful and caring. To many, he seemed like the perfect boyfriend, the perfect neighbor, the perfect student. But psychologists warn that this was the very reason Bundy was so dangerous. He proved that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious warning signs. Instead, it can hide behind a mask of normalcy. Experts who studied Bundy often describe him as a textbook psychopath. Psychopathy is defined by traits such as superficial charm, a lack of empathy, manipulativeness, and a need for control. Bundy demonstrated all of these, often to an extreme degree. He could charm strangers instantly, convincing them to trust him. He could lie without hesitation, weaving stories so convincing that even experienced investigators doubted their instincts. And he seemed completely incapable of feeling genuine remorse. When asked about his actions, Bundy often deflected blame. At one point, he even suggested that violent media and pornography had influenced him, as though external forces, not his own choices, were responsible for his actions. For psychologists, Bundy became a case study in how dangerous a psychopath can be when intelligence and charm are added to the mix. Another key aspect of Bundy's psychology was control. Bundy wasn't motivated by money or revenge. He didn't commit his crimes for financial gain or to settle grudges. Instead, he was driven by an overwhelming desire to dominate others, to exert power in the most terrifying way possible. This need for control extended beyond his crimes. It was present in his everyday life. Bundy controlled how others saw him. He carefully crafted his image as a clean-cut, polite young man. He manipulated his girlfriends into believing he was loyal. He manipulated friends and co-workers into believing he was trustworthy. Even in prison, Bundy tried to control the narrative. He gave selective interviews, revealing only what he wanted people to hear. He delayed confessions, holding back details as bargaining chips to try and postpone his execution. Control was his obsession, his addiction, and his downfall. The media played a huge role in shaping Bundy's story. Because his trial was one of the first to be televised nationally, Bundy became a household name. People across America watched him smile at the cameras, argue legal points, and act with a confidence that felt surreal for a man accused of such horrific crimes. Some viewers were horrified. Others were captivated. There were even women who wrote him letters in prison, convinced of his innocence or drawn in by his charm. This phenomenon became known as hybristophilia, a condition where individuals are attracted to those who commit violent crimes. Bundy wasn't the first criminal to inspire such attention, but he became the most famous example. For criminologists, this media obsession raised questions. Were people fascinated by Bundy because of his crimes, or because of the shocking contrast between his outward appearance and his hidden life? The answer most agree is both. Bundy shattered people's assumptions about what a monster should look like. He wasn't lurking in shadows. He was standing in daylight, smiling. Bundy's case also changed law enforcement. At the time of his crimes, police departments in different states often worked in isolation. There were no national databases, no instant ways to compare cases across jurisdictions. Bundy took advantage of this, moving from Washington to Utah, from Utah to Colorado, and eventually to Florida. After his capture, investigators realized just how many cases might have been connected if information had been shared more effectively. His case became one of the driving forces behind better cooperation between states and the eventual creation of nationwide crime databases. In many ways, Bundy's crimes helped shape the modern system of criminal investigation. Perhaps the most disturbing question of all is whether Bundy was born evil or shaped by his environment. Some experts argue that Bundy's childhood planted the seeds of his behavior. He grew up in a household filled with secrecy, believing his mother was his sister and his grandparents were his parents. This confusion about identity may have created deep anger and resentment. Others point to early signs of disturbing behavior, like voyeurism and theft, which were largely ignored or dismissed at the time. But many psychologists believe Bundy was born with a brain wired differently. Research on psychopathy suggests that some individuals are biologically predisposed to lack empathy and remorse. Bundy, they argue, was one of these rare and dangerous cases. The truth is likely a combination of both: an environment that failed to correct his early behavior, and a brain that was predisposed to manipulation and violence. Even decades after his death, Bundy continues to fascinate. Books, documentaries, and films have been made about his life. Each retells the story in a slightly different way, but all grapple with the same haunting questions. How did he manage to fool so many people for so long? How many lives did he really take? And most chillingly, could someone like him still exist today? Experts agree that Bundy's ability to hide in plain sight was his greatest weapon. His case serves as a reminder that appearances can be deceiving, and that danger doesn't always look the way we expect it to. One of the last interviews Bundy gave was to a Christian broadcaster, where he spoke about his life and the path that had led him to death row. Many who watched the interview felt he was still manipulating, still trying to control the narrative, even in his final days. He offered partial confessions, admitted to some of his crimes, but always in vague or evasive terms. To the very end, Bundy remained a man of masks, a man who told just enough truth to keep people listening, but never enough to fully reveal who he was. And perhaps that is what makes his story so terrifying. Even after all the investigations, all the interviews, and all the analysis, the real Ted Bundy remains a mystery. Bundy's life has left behind not just a trail of tragedy, but also valuable lessons. His case forced law enforcement to evolve. It gave psychologists insights into the darkest corners of the human mind. And it forced society to confront the uncomfortable truth that evil doesn't always come from the shadows. It can come from a smiling face, from someone who seems like the person you'd least suspect. His story is a warning, reminder, and a mystery that still lingers. As Ted Bundy sat on death row in Florida throughout the 1980s, his life became the subject of endless fascination. Journalists, psychologists, law enforcement officers, and even ordinary people wanted to understand him. How could someone so outwardly normal commit such monstrous acts? How many victims were there? And why did he keep so many secrets, even as the clock ticked toward his execution? For nearly a decade, Bundy held onto those answers, dangling them like bargaining chips as he tried to delay his fate. Bundy's final years were marked by a strange mix of isolation and attention. Inside prison, he lived under tight security, aware that the world outside was watching his every move. He gave selective interviews, sometimes admitting to parts of his crimes, but always in a way that kept him in control. To law enforcement, Bundy's withholding of information was deeply frustrating. Families of missing women wanted closure, but Bundy rarely gave clear answers. He seemed to enjoy the power of secrecy, knowing that he was the only one who could fill in the missing pieces. As his execution date drew closer, Bundy began to open up, at least partially. In 1989, just days before he was scheduled to die, Bundy gave a series of interviews to investigators from states across the country. In these final conversations, he admitted to crimes that had long been suspected but never proven. The numbers remain unclear, but Bundy hinted at dozens of victims, spread across multiple states. Some estimates suggest the number may have been over 30, though Bundy himself never gave a definitive count. These last-minute confessions were chilling. They revealed a man who had operated with precision, intelligence, and cruelty for years, slipping through the cracks of law enforcement again and again. One of the most haunting aspects of Bundy's final interviews was the way he spoke about his crimes. He often used detached language, as though he were describing someone else. He avoided personal responsibility, framing his actions as compulsions he couldn't control. And even when he admitted guilt, there was a sense of calculation in his words, as if he were still trying to manage how others saw him. Psychologists noted that Bundy never expressed true remorse. He showed regret only in terms of how his life had ended, not in terms of the pain he had caused. This lack of empathy is one of the defining traits of psychopathy, and Bundy demonstrated it until the very end. As Bundy's execution date approached, the media frenzy intensified. Television crews gathered outside the prison. Reporters filed daily updates. Crowds of people camped nearby, holding signs that read things like, "Burn, Bundy, burn." Some treated it like a public spectacle, cheering for justice. Others came out of morbid curiosity, simply wanting to be present for the end of the story. It was unlike anything America had seen before. Bundy's execution was not just a legal event, it was a cultural one. On the morning of January 24, 1989, Ted Bundy was executed in Florida's electric chair. Witnesses described the moment as surreal. Some people wept for the victims, others cheered. Outside the prison, the crowd erupted in celebration, with people chanting and waving signs. The man who had spent his life controlling others, manipulating the truth, and hiding behind charm was finally gone. But his story, of course, was far from over. In the years since Bundy's death, his case has continued to shape how we understand crime, psychology, and human nature. For law enforcement, Bundy's crimes highlighted the need for stronger cooperation between states and better tools for tracking criminals who operate across multiple jurisdictions. Today's national databases, forensic technology, and coordinated investigative efforts were shaped, in part, by cases like Bundy's. For psychologists, Bundy became a defining case study in psychopathy. His blend of charm, intelligence, and cold-blooded violence made him one of the most extreme examples of the condition. His interviews, trials, and behavior continue to be analyzed in classrooms and research papers around the world. And for the public, Bundy remains a chilling reminder of deception. He showed us that monsters do not always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like the man next door. But Bundy's story also raised deeper cultural questions. Why was the public so fascinated with him? Why did his trial draw such massive attention? Why, even decades later, are books, films, and documentaries still being made about him? Part of the answer lies in the contradictions. Bundy wasn't the stereotype of a violent criminal. He wasn't disheveled, aggressive, or visibly disturbed. Instead, he was polite, well-dressed, and intelligent. The contrast between his appearance and his actions created a kind of cognitive dissonance that people couldn't look away from. Another part of the answer lies in fear. Bundy's crimes struck at the heart of something deeply unsettling: the idea that evil can hide in plain sight. He didn't attack in dark alleys or deserted streets. He struck in broad daylight, on college campuses, and even in crowded parks. He exploited trust, compassion, and kindness, the very things that hold communities together. That fear, the fear that anyone could be hiding a secret life, helped cement Bundy's place in history. There are also lessons in Bundy's story. One is the importance of awareness. Bundy used simple tricks, like pretending to be injured, to lure his victims. Today, many safety experts teach people to be cautious of such tactics, reminding us that not every request for help is genuine. Another lesson is the danger of underestimating manipulation. Bundy's charm fooled not only strangers but also friends, co-workers, and even law enforcement officers. His ability to project normalcy reminds us that appearances can be deceiving, and that trust should never be given blindly. Finally, Bundy's story is a lesson about accountability. For years, he avoided consequences by escaping, lying, and manipulating. But in the end, the truth caught up with him. His life serves as a reminder that no mask can last forever. Even today, Bundy's name carries weight. He has become a symbol of hidden evil, a cautionary tale told in classrooms, documentaries, and crime studies. But behind the fascination, it is important not to lose sight of the real story: the lives of the victims, the families who suffered, and the communities left scarred by his actions. Bundy may have wanted to be remembered as someone larger than life, someone too clever to be caught. But history has remembered him for what he truly was: a manipulator, a predator, and a warning to future generations. As we reflect on Bundy's final days, the image is clear. Here was a man who believed he was smarter than everyone else. A man who believed he could manipulate his way out of any situation. A man who believed he could control the narrative until his last breath. But in the end, Bundy lost the one thing he valued most: control. And that, perhaps, is the final lesson of his life: that no matter how carefully someone crafts their mask, the truth will eventually be revealed. The story of Ted Bundy is more than just the biography of a criminal. It is a mirror, one that forces society to confront uncomfortable truths about deception, trust, and the darkest corners of human psychology. Even decades after his execution, Bundy continues to fascinate, horrify, and disturb. He has become a cultural figure not because of admiration, but because of what he represents: the danger of evil hidden in plain sight. Bundy's legacy in criminology is undeniable. His case became one of the most studied examples of psychopathy. Experts around the world still analyze his interviews, his courtroom behavior, and his ability to manipulate those around him. Bundy's blend of intelligence, charm, and violence showed how dangerous a psychopath can be when their abilities are used for control rather than for good. His case underscored the importance of identifying traits of manipulation early and understanding how individuals like him can exploit trust. Today, criminology courses often dedicate entire lectures to Bundy. His name appears in textbooks as a warning and as a lesson. He has, in many ways, become the face of the modern serial predator. Bundy also left a mark on law enforcement practices. In the 1970s, communication between police departments across states was limited. Cases of missing women in Washington, Utah, Colorado, and Florida were not immediately connected. Bundy thrived in this lack of coordination, moving across state lines and evading suspicion. After his capture, his case highlighted the urgent need for national databases and better collaboration. Today's systems like the FBI's VICAP, Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, were influenced by lessons learned from Bundy's crimes. Bundy also inspired the use of behavioral profiling. Investigators began studying psychological patterns, not just physical evidence, to predict and identify offenders. This laid the groundwork for what many know today as criminal profiling, a tool made famous in both real investigations and popular culture. But beyond criminology and law enforcement, Bundy's case forces us to look at something even more unsettling: the psychology of trust. Bundy didn't succeed because he was violent. He succeeded because he was believable. He looked like the kind of man who could be trusted. He used props, a sling, a cast, a friendly smile, to make himself appear safe. He preyed on kindness, exploiting the natural human instinct to help others. That is why his story continues to resonate. It teaches us that danger is not always obvious, and that trust must be balanced with caution. Bundy has often been compared to other notorious figures in criminal history. Some compare him to John Wayne Gacy, who also lived a double life as a community volunteer while committing terrible crimes. Others compare him to Jeffrey Dahmer, whose crimes shocked the world for their brutality. But Bundy remains unique in one important way. He turned his own trial into a spectacle. Unlike others, Bundy didn't shy away from the cameras. He embraced them, smiling at reporters, speaking confidently, and trying to craft his own image. In many ways, he turned his crimes into a stage, with himself as the lead actor. This is one of the reasons Bundy's story has endured. He was not just a criminal, he was a manipulator of perception. And in a world driven by media, perception can be powerful. Bundy's influence even extends into popular culture. Decades after his death, movies, documentaries, and books about him continue to be produced. Some focus on the investigation, others on his psychology, and some on the cultural fascination with his case. While this constant retelling raises questions, such as whether it risks glorifying him, it also reflects society's need to understand. Bundy is a reminder of the questions that haunt us. How could someone appear so normal yet commit such atrocities? Could someone like him exist today? And most importantly, what can we learn from his story? For modern audiences, Bundy's story carries new relevance. In an age of digital communication, where identities can be faked and appearances carefully crafted, Bundy's deception feels eerily familiar. Today, predators can hide behind social media profiles, online personas, or carefully edited images. Just as Bundy used charm and manipulation in person, others can now use technology to achieve the same ends. This makes his story not just a lesson from history, but a warning for the present. Awareness, caution, and education are the tools we have today to prevent manipulation and exploitation. Bundy's case reminds us why they are so important. Yet, as much as Bundy's story is studied, there is a risk in focusing too much on him and not enough on the people he hurt. The true tragedy of this story lies not in Bundy's life, but in the lives that were cut short. Dozens of young women with bright futures, families who never stopped grieving, and communities that lived in fear. All were the true victims of Bundy's actions. To remember only Bundy is to miss the point. His name may be infamous, but the women he harmed should not be forgotten. Their stories matter more than his. So what, in the end, can we take away from the strange and terrifying saga of Ted Bundy? First, that evil can wear a mask. Can look polite, friendly, even charming. Doesn't always come with warning signs. Second, that systems must evolve. Bundy's crimes revealed weaknesses in law enforcement and psychology at the time. Those weaknesses have since been addressed, saving lives in future generations. Third, that human nature is both powerful and vulnerable. Our instinct to trust, to help, and to connect is what makes us human. But it can also be exploited. Awareness is the balance we must carry. In the end, Ted Bundy believed he could outsmart everyone. He believed he could manipulate until his final breath. But his story shows us something far greater: that truth, persistence, and justice can overcome even the most deceptive masks. His life may have been defined by manipulation, but his legacy is defined by lessons. Lessons that continue to shape psychology, law enforcement, and public awareness to this very day. And so, as we close this story, one final thought remains. Ted Bundy wanted control. He wanted to decide how people saw him. He wanted to be remembered as clever, as charming, as untouchable. But history did not give him that. History remembers Ted Bundy for what he truly was: a manipulator, predator, a warning carved into the memory of a nation.